Chapter 14, Year 5, Part 4. Harry hardly saw where he was walking, his mind abuzz with schemes and questions. He felt, without being capable of articulating it right this moment, that a lot of things, too many things, weren't adding up. Lucius Malfoy's presence was odd, as was the whole situation with Umbridge, but he didn't have the time to think any of it through. Every step he took brought him closer to danger, so he needed to focus on what was important right now. Getting himself the fuck out of this fix was important. He'd already tried walking off on different excuses, but someone had always volunteered to go till the ends of the earth with him. However, he was reaching the boiling point. If anyone accompanied him, he'd just stun them, obliviate them, imperious them, whatever, he didn't care. He'd already opened his mouth to proclaim his intention to return to the dormitories when Madame Hooch appeared from around the next corner. "Headmaster," she said, looking relieved to see Dumbledore. "There are 2 gentlemen looking for you." The 2 wizards in official ministry robes were following her. One of the men was dressed in bright scarlet and had a stocky build. The other wore midnight blue robes and was somehow long and sour-looking. "Auror Dawlish, Mr. Croaker," Dumbledore said, inclining his head. An interested murmur swept through Harry's classmates, while he gritted his teeth. It seemed that his intentions would be thwarted at every turn today. "Evening, Dumbledore," said the man addressed as Croaker. "Never meant to barge in like this. Dinner ought to be over, we'd have thought." "Not to worry," Dumbledore said. "We've had some unforeseen circumstances interrupting our schedule." "Very well," the Auror Dawlish started, but then Lucius Malfoy stepped forward. "Good evening, Dawlish," he said with a smile. "Mr. Malfoy!" the Auror exclaimed, eyes widening. "Blimey, sir, good evening." "This is a fortunate meeting indeed," Lucius stated. "Draco tells me that Mr. Potter is going to the ministry today, and I find myself interested in accompanying him. Perhaps I shall go along with you." "That's out of order," Croaker declared. "This is official ministry business. No unauthorized additions allowed." Judging by Lucius Malfoy's face, he didn't appreciate being called an unauthorized addition. "Oh, I think that, if you asked the minister, you would find that he would authorize my presence immediately," Lucius drawled. "What do you think, Dawlish?" The Auror looked uncertainly between Croaker and Malfoy. "I'm certain you wouldn't suggest anything that the minister wouldn't approve of, Mr. Malfoy, sir," he mumbled. "Indeed," Malfoy inclined his head slightly. "I would not compromise the minister's trust, I assure you." Naturally, Dumbledore said. "Now, you gentlemen have arrived somewhat early, so I'm convinced we would all benefit from some fortification with tea. Or perhaps you might consent to stay for dinner." "Really, Dumbledore, we should get cracking," Dawlish said. "There's some security arrangements to conduct before we leave, so we'd better start. Could we find a more private area?" he asked, eyeing the congregated students in barely concealed distaste. Harry glanced at Dumbledore. If there were security checks to be passed, Harry would need to get that done before switching with Tonks, which was fine, but another delay, and he wasn't sure how many more he could withstand. "Of course," Dumbledore said. "This way, please." Anthony and Terry looked worried. Padma was biting her lip. Millicent was frowning, and Blaise just muttered a quiet, "Be careful," before Harry set off after the adults. Harry would dearly like to turn back around and curse Malfoy, Nott, and Parkinson to all 7 hells for smirking in an impossibly superior way, but he had bigger things to worry about. Like exactly what this ministry security would entail. Casting his mind back to Dumbledore's explanations in January, Harry could only recall that identification tests had been mentioned. In fact, the Order had been nervous that Tonks would fail to pass them at the ministry. Dumbledore gave Harry an encouraging smile. Harry was not encouraged. After a short walk, they ended up in a small chamber just off the entrance hall. Croaker immediately withdrew a small pouch from his pocket. He then incongruously produced out of it a bunch of scrolls and a mirror about 3 times the pouch's size. "Simple procedure," Croaker declared. "Would every one of you, in turn, look into this mirror? Yes, Mr. Malfoy, you as well, if you intend to accompany us." "What is special about the mirror?" Harry had to ask. "It is a monitoring mirror," Croaker said. "Reveals every deception and disguise. Mr. Malfoy?" With the air of someone from whom a great sacrifice was being unfairly required, Malfoy walked over and glanced into the mirror. One of the scrolls sprung to life at once, and Malfoy's name appeared on it in neat cursive. Croaker nodded approvingly. "You next, Mr. Potter." Nothing special transpired when Harry looked at his reflection, except for another scroll unfurling and giving up his full name. Harry wondered what the mirror would have done if Tonks had been here in his stead. Dawlish had apparently been tested before, because the monitoring mirror was put away as soon as Dumbledore was finished, and then Croaker demanded that they all sign the parchment with their names on it. As it turned out, this was to signify that they were aware they could not disclose anything seen at the Department of Mysteries. All in all, as far as security arrangements went, Harry felt it could have been a lot worse. "Very well," Croaker said. "We may leave immediately." "Oh, but—" Harry began, and then didn't know how to continue. "What, right now?" He threw a frantic glance at Dumbledore, only to find that he was watching Lucius Malfoy, who was watching Harry. "You requested to go in the first place, didn't you, Mr. Potter?" Dawlish said, and now he looked at the time. "Yes, but I'm not feeling so well," Harry said, suddenly seeing what he'd been missing all this time. Too bad he didn't have any nosebleed nougat or puking pastils on him. "I think one of Professor Umbridge's spells hit me. Oh, you haven't heard she went a bit strange. Anyway, I really don't think I can go right now, so if I could just go lie down for a while." Croaker surveyed him in displeasure. "Mr. Potter, our portkey leaves in 15 minutes. Portkey wards over the Department of Ministries have been lifted especially on your account for a 30-second window. If you are feeling unwell, you may cancel today's appointment and arrange a time for another day, but you must decide now." Oh, well, if he must. "I am feeling rather unwell," Harry began, but then Dumbledore interrupted him by addressing the officials. "Would you excuse Mr. Potter and myself for one moment?" Croaker's expression darkened. "Kindly bear in mind that our portkey is leaving soon." Harry allowed Dumbledore to lead him a slight bit away, frowning all the while. From the dampening noise around them, Harry discerned that the man had put up a non-verbal soundboard. "Harry," Dumbledore said, "the progress that we could achieve tonight matters more than you perhaps realize. Things have not been going well for us, I fear. Not well at all. Voldemort has been recruiting allies since June, and he has been successful, more successful than we. If we do not check his progress, the war will be lost, because he has been ignored for too long." Harry was used to motivational speeches. He'd given a fair share himself, so he felt he could withstand Dumbledore's sorrowful gaze without cracking. "The Ministry, or at the very least the Minister, will not acknowledge Voldemort's return without irrefutable proof," Dumbledore continued, sparing a look at the officials. "While it is beyond doubt that Voldemort will eventually produce it, it would be disastrous to let him announce his return on his own terms, because he will not do so until he is ready and assured of victory. By then it will be much too late." "I understand that," Harry said. "But why are you so sure that I have to go? Voldemort knows we'll be there tonight. He's probably lying in wait already. You could just go, without me, and find him there." "That cannot be," Dumbledore refuted calmly. "Surely you realize the purpose behind Lucius Malfoy's presence?" "Making sure I don't get lost on the way to the Ministry?" Dumbledore shook his head. "You are correct, but not entirely. Voldemort has no plans to expose himself unless he has proof that Harry Potter will in fact appear tonight to withdraw the prophecy. Lucius Malfoy will give him the signal when we are leaving to the Ministry, or perhaps when we are already there. It could even be that Voldemort plans to use the same 30-second window of opportunity that our Mr. Croaker was so explicit about. Harry thought he'd have figured out the reason behind Malfoy's presence, had he not been so preoccupied with all the other stuff that kept happening. "We have always known Voldemort would exercise some sort of observation," Dumbledore added. "We envisaged a lookout at the Ministry to notify him of our arrival, but he has chosen differently." "Fine," Harry conceded. "I can see that. I still don't see why we can't postpone this meeting. Didn't we originally decide that the plan wouldn't go through if Tonks couldn't replace me? Especially if we can just arrange things for another day, like Croaker said." "We are reasonably sure of Voldemort's actions tonight," Dumbledore replied. "We know more or less how things will proceed. If we miss this chance, we shall be flung again into the realm of unpredictability, and there is no saying that we will be able to plan in advance again." "But," Harry lowered his voice, even despite the words, "Professor Snape—" "He has received no information regarding tonight's events," Dumbledore said. "It is reasonable to suppose that Voldemort does not yet trust him to any significant degree. Severus is doing his best, but his possibilities are limited." Harry held in a scowl by sheer effort of will. "Yes, but it doesn't mean that I have to go. With all due respect, sir, I don't see why I should get involved in something that has nothing to do with me." He knew already as he said it that the words rang false and wrong and petulant, and he'd almost anticipated Dumbledore's thoughtful, "Nothing to do with you? I thought that you have been the one insisting that this war has everything to do with you." Because he had. He had been the one insisting for so long that he wanted to fight, that he wanted to be included on the information to do with this war, because he was entitled to it by virtue of his own involvement. And yet, when things came to a head, he didn't want to get involved. Harry glared at the stone floor under his feet. He'd been so content in letting the Order handle this plan without him that he hadn't really stopped to think what the plan meant for his position in the war. And really, it sounded like he should have given it some prior thought beyond the immediate need to assure his own safety. He knew that he'd have to fight Voldemort, which meant that he had a vested interest in checking Voldemort's progress if and while he could. If giving up on the plan would really create such a huge setback, on the grand scheme of things, wouldn't it make sense, strategic, political sense, for him to go? Or then not. Or then it could be completely idiotic to go, spelling his own doom level of stupid, because what sane person went into a dangerous situation knowing they were in no way prepared? "I may have been the one saying I want to get involved," Harry said, "but you were the one saying I was too young, sir. What happened to that?" Dumbledore seemed to age several decades before Harry's eyes. "This unfortunate collusion of circumstances perturbs me more than words can describe, and I assure you that I will do everything in my power to keep you safe, should you agree to help us in this mission. Please believe me that I regret asking so much from you." "But you ask anyway," Harry muttered. Regret or not, the result was the same, and Harry wasn't sure what he felt about that, except the frustration that he felt towards everything right at that moment. By going, Harry would put himself in danger. This was an irrefutable fact. Harry's self-preservation instinct, honed to perfection, was screaming at him to back out of this and run as fast as he could. However, and this was a creeping, unpleasant realization that reverberated through Harry's mind in ways that reshuffled plans and hopes and ideas of self, he wasn't going to get through the war and reach his goal without taking some risks. Harry had thought he was aware of it, but the shock he felt at the idea of actually risking himself told him he'd been wrong. Very glaringly, stupidly wrong. He'd thought he could prepare and reach the point when he'd be ready. He started taking time and freedom to prepare for granted. He'd begun believing that he'd be able to choose his own battles. This was laughable in retrospect. Voldemort had never given an indication that he'd wait for Harry to get ready. There was no reason to expect that Harry would even live through his next birthday, never mind long enough to get ready. Sometime he needed to stop letting things happen and start acting instead, even if ready remained a far-off concept. Was this the time to start? Fuck only knew. However, a very important plan would fail if Harry didn't go to the ministry, and that meant the first real test of what Harry was willing to do for his cause, as opposed to just plan on doing it. Out of the corner of his eye, Harry noticed movement, and turned around to see Dawlish stalking purposefully towards him and Dumbledore. "Please, Headmaster, we are on a tight schedule," Dawlish exclaimed. "Our portkey is leaving in 8 minutes. If Mr. Potter feels ill enough to cancel the appointment, he must say so. If he wishes to go, we must leave at once." There was a pause. "Harry?" Dumbledore prompted. More than anything, Harry wanted time. Time to evaluate everything. Time to choose the right way to act. Time to take a deep breath. Time that he did not have. "Can you swear to me that this is as important as you're making it out to be?" he asked Dumbledore, in one last-ditch attempt to determine something, fully aware that it wasn't going to help him at all. "Yes, I can swear I shall endeavour to keep you safe," Dumbledore said solemnly. "I shall create you an outward portkey, and call Fawkes." Dawlish was going a little purple in the face from seeing, but not hearing them interact. Dumbledore lifted the soundboard. "Then I'd like that portkey. Yes," Harry said to Dawlish, but he was looking at Dumbledore. He wasn't even half sure that he'd made the right decision, and kept deliberating all through being rushed along corridors towards Hogwarts grounds, and then out of the gates. Maybe he should have said no, but maybe he should have said yes long ago, and maybe he should have done so many other things differently, and maybe he'd never get the chance now. Head spinning with the possibilities of all that he should have risked, or had not done, or was marching off towards, Harry laid his hand on the portkey that would deposit him and the adults at the Department of Mysteries. The portkey landed Harry and his companions in a black corridor in front of an equally black door, and there were 2 seconds of perfect silence. Then an elevator gave a ping in the distance. "Right this way," Croaker said, gesturing towards the door. "Follow me." Harry wasn't sure when he'd taken his wand out, but he became aware of gripping it in his hand. The door Croaker opened before them led to a circular room, the main feature of which were another 11 identically black doors and branches of candles burning with blue light. Together with a black floor and black ceiling and black everything, this created a surreal environment, which might have been the point. A glance at Malfoy revealed that he too was tense, and he kept looking back at Dumbledore, who completed their procession. Dawlish and Croaker seemed to be the only ones not aware that they were walking, literally, into a trap. Maybe not behind the next door, and maybe not behind the next one still, but somewhere in this silent department were Death Eaters waiting for them to arrive. Or, if they weren't yet, they'd soon be coming from behind. Croaker pressed his hand against one door and murmured something under his breath. The door started spinning rapidly with a soft whooshing noise. Croaker's hand still pressed firmly to what was alternatively a wall or a door. Dumbledore chose that moment to appear by Harry's side. "Here," he said quietly, pressing a small object into Harry's hand. "Your portkey" was likely the next word, but then suddenly several things happened in very close succession. The door stopped spinning, and an odd, constricting sensation came over Harry. Next, Croaker opened the door in front of him, and "Avada Kedavra!" Spells flashed from behind the door, and Harry couldn't count how many black robes and white masks there were. Most of the Death Eaters remained behind cover, but a couple charged ahead. Shrieks ringing in his ear, Harry dashed instinctively to the side and threw up a shield. None of the spells were aimed at him. Instead, the Death Eaters let out a volley of killing curses at Dumbledore. Harry tried to shout out a warning, even though Dumbledore must have seen them. Then a curse impacted his shield. Harry turned to see that Lucius Malfoy, unlike unknown Death Eaters behind that door, wasn't aiming at Dumbledore. He was pointing his wand straight at Harry, and so was, suddenly, inexplicably, Auror Dawlish. Vexo, Harry thought, thrusting his wand at Dawlish, and dodged another curse from Malfoy. Not an unforgivable, notably, but should Harry cast any at the Ministry? Ango, he added mentally, twisting his wand. Mulco, Caio. As Lucius batted Harry's curses aside, Harry quickly reacted out for the door beside him and pushed it open. They were at a distinct disadvantage here. He and Dumbledore, in this small rounded space between all the doors. They had no cover, and they were easily surrounded. Where was the order? Harry ran into the room before he'd managed to develop that thought, and was beginning to wonder about Dumbledore when the old man appeared next to him in a flash of flames and a trill of phoenix song. "This will give us but a moment," Dumbledore said, transfiguring the door into a solid block of granite. "But we need that moment dearly." Harry focused on him without even looking properly around the room. He just noticed that it was spacious and rectangular, with desks standing in rows, various artifacts upon them. "The portkey, sir," Harry said urgently. "How do I activate the portkey that you gave me?" He tried to concentrate on that matter and ignore the shouts from the other side of the door. "You do not," Dumbledore said, and didn't blink at Harry's incredulous look. "Getting here has taken too long, and the portkey wards have come back into force again, although you may not have felt it." "Then," Harry shook his head, "how do I get out?" "The atrium," Dumbledore said. "The portkey will leave from the atrium. However, Fawkes—" Dumbledore turned his head to look at the gold and crimson bird perched on his shoulder. "Would you escort Harry back into Hogwarts?" Harry recalled the time back in his second year when Fawkes had rescued him from the Chamber of Secrets and felt his spirits rise. Surely Fawkes will be able to help him. But the bird gave a trill and did not move. Dumbledore frowned, looking at it. "This is very important," he implored, raising his voice over the sound of spells exploding against the door. "Harry Potter requires your help." Another stubborn trill, and Harry couldn't believe what he was seeing. The bloody bird was refusing. "Why?" he asked, involuntarily. Dumbledore transferred his cloudy gaze onto him now. "You are no longer innocent," the headmaster said, and every word sounded heavy, as if it came with effort. "You have touched magics that have rendered you unclean. I cannot fault you for your lack of loyalty to me, but, Harry, what have you done?" Harry's mind was blank. What had he done? Nothing that he could think of. He'd dabbled in questionable magic, yes, but so did everyone in Slytherin. And what was he supposed to learn from Montague and Bletchley and Pusey, if not that? Could that really taint him so badly? No, those things didn't matter. And if the bloody phoenix counted that unforgivable Harry had cast against Voldemort back in the day, fuck that. "I haven't done anything," Harry began. But now was never going to be the time, because then the door finally gave under the sheer brute force of the spells levelled at it. The sounds of violent fight burst into the room, and Harry saw that Death Eaters weren't the only people waiting on the other side of the door. There was Lupin and Shacklebolt and Moody, and Black, whose shoulder gave a sickening crack as it collided with the door-frame. He snarled and retaliated with a curse at his opponent, and that opponent gave a loud, deranged laugh, and her hood fell off as she was propelled into the room by the force of Black's spell. Bellatrix Lestrange. Well, how fucking nice. "Crucio!" she yelled. One pointed at Black, and Black grabbed a cloaked Death Eater and swung him into the path of her curse. He screamed. Bellatrix laughed. Black did too. This was complete chaos, bodies colliding with each other, curses flashing and no place to turn, with the door thus blocked. Unless there was another exit? "Potter!" someone screamed, all triumphant recognition, and Harry was already shielding, but then Dumbledore wove his wand in a complicated arc, and the space around them cleared. Harry eyed the Death Eaters who'd been scattered as if by a gust of wind, and looked at Dumbledore. You must reach the atrium, Dumbledore said. Kingsley! Shacklebolt was nearby. His opponent had just collapsed, knocked out. Harry glanced from him to see Hestia Jones, who was engaged in a fierce battle. Judging by her pallor, she was losing. Whoever she was fighting clearly knew and enjoyed what they were doing. Kingsley, I must go and find Voldemort, Dumbledore said, not to be distracted. We cannot allow him to disappear in this ruckus. He will be gone as soon as he hears the prophecy. Harry saw Hestia Jones fall, and the Death Eater standing above her raise his wand again. Ozymovi! Harry fired. The Death Eater's suddenly boneless arm flopped down, and he swore, looking around for the culprit. Good one, Tonks, Kingsley said. The Death Eater's answering curse bounced off Dumbledore's shield and reflected back, and then the other fighters concealed him from view. Kingsley, this is Harry, not Nymphadora, Dumbledore said, drawing their attention again. Kingsley's eyes widened minutely on his usually impassive face. Harry must get to the atrium as soon as possible, for then he can leave by a portkey, Dumbledore continued. Understood, Kingsley said. Very well, Dumbledore replied, and disappeared in another flash of flames, the phoenix and all. It was as if a security blanket had been lifted. Harry dodged as a curse flew right by him. Stay close to me, Kingsley ordered, looking uneasy. Fine, Harry said, and saw another curse impact the shield around him and Kingsley. Strangely, nothing lethal was aimed at Harry. Why ever not? Saving him up for Voldemort? Harry didn't like that idea. Come on now, quickly, Kingsley said. He started dragging Harry through the crowd. A curse flying at them, and Harry was already saying the counter when Kingsley pushed him out of the way. What? Not now, Kingsley muttered, and made to drag Harry out of his spell's way again, but Harry swerved out of his grasp, fired a counter, and found himself face to face with a dark-haired Death Eater blocking their way. Dolohov, Kingsley said. Incarcerus! Dolohov waved the curse away with a devil-may-care smile. Explodere caputem, Harry cast in a whisper, and ignored Kingsley's start. Harry Potter, Dolohov said. The rumours weren't exaggerated. What, about Harry casting head-exploding curses? Dolohov's Cruciatus collided with an odd boulder Kingsley had summoned to put between the Death Eater and Harry, and the next with a summoned pyramid, and the next with a globe of the sky. I can do that myself. Could you maybe attack him or something? Harry said, incensed, but Kingsley only frowned harder. My job is to protect you, he bit out. I can protect myself. Harry fired a non-verbal choking curse to prove it, but the curse collided with the model of Stonehenge Kingsley had summoned next. All three of them put up shields to defend from the flying debris. Harry swore. Dolohov smiled. These people don't think very highly of you, Harry Potter, he said, and proved his own appreciation by firing another Cruciatus in Harry's direction. Kingsley summoned a vase to protect Harry. Harry thought it would make more sense for him to defend himself, while Kingsley attacked Dolohov, but fine. Diriperviscus, Harry cast. Crucio, Dolohov responded, dodging the entrails expelling curse. Kingsley defended Harry with his summoned clock. Lasiscavi, Harry added quickly. Crucio! Another pyramid before Harry. Commuta in membrana. Crucio! A sundial before Harry, but nothing hit it, because the Cruciatus diverted towards Kingsley at the last second. Kingsley collapsed with a half-scream, half-gurgle. Harry threw the sundial back at Dolohov, forcing him to break concentration and lift the unforgivable. But then Dolohov cast another quick torture curse at Harry, and while he was dodging, pointed his wand at Kingsley. Chetvertovat tebya kak naberesak. Kingsley's whole body contracted. Suddenly it was as if invisible force tore at him, pulling him by his legs and his arms in 4 directions. It stretched impossibly, trying to tear Kingsley's body apart, while his face contorted in horror. Harry swallowed against bile rising in his throat. "Stop it," he found himself saying to Dolohov. Fuck you! Just stop this! Crucio! You bastard! Avada Kedavra! The fear of being caught casting unforgivables at the ministry faded before the urgent need to make Kingsley's torture stop. "Don't worry, little Potter," Dolohov laughed, dodging. "It won't be my pleasure to do the same to you." Harry noticed that it was quieter now, and looked around the room to see that only Moody and Barty Crouch Jr. were still there, locked in a duel. Bloodstains stood on the wooden floor, and the smell of sweat and fear hung in the air. Loud explosions and shouts were coming from somewhere outside of the room. There was no one here to help, and Kingsley needed medical help very soon. "Avada Kedavra!" Harry cast desperately. "You could still beg for forgiveness, you know," Dolohov said, dodging again. "He might forgive you if you say how sorry you are and how good you will be." Harry felt the next cruciatus coming intuitively, and lurched to the side, not a moment too late. "Oh, this is not fun at all," Dolohov said. "Let us spice things, yes?" The wand in Dolohov's hand became the handle of a blazing whip. He swung at Harry. Harry dodged, eyes widening. He tried to counter with water, but that only made the whip flame harder. He backed away, further from where Kingsley lay, now unmoving. He summoned things to shield himself, and tried a cutting curse on the whip and a blasting on Dolohov. He really couldn't aim with that flaming whip flying about before him and protecting Dolohov in a hazy, ever-moving wall of flames, and the main thing weighing on his mind wasn't his own duel, but how Kingsley was doing, and he knew he needed to pull himself together and concentrate. "Avada Kedavra," Harry whispered again. But Dolohov was already twisting, and already turning, and his spell didn't falter, even for a second. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Harry saw the bright flash of a curse, and Moody charging at him and Dolohov. "Go to Kingsley, he's over there!" Harry shouted. "You need help!" Moody panted out. Harry dodged another blow of the whip, fired a non-verbal KO at Dolohov, and turned to Moody. "Have a look at Kingsley first!" His attention had been diverted for a fraction of a second, but Dolohov was fast. Pain assaulted Harry's left shoulder as the whip hit him, and Harry gritted his teeth against crying out. "Just a taste, Potter," Dolohov promised. "Alas, that is all I can give you." "Step aside, Tonks," Moody ordered. Harry felt warm blood well up from the wound, but didn't look at it, his eyes still glued to Dolohov's every move. "Look at Kingsley," Harry insisted. "He's much worse than me. Crucio," he whispered, once Moody disappeared from his peripheral vision. "Tonks," Dolohov repeated. "The old man thinks you are... no matter." It was a good thing, too, that Moody thought Harry was Tonks. He'd never have gone and left him, injured, alone with Dolohov otherwise. Harry normally wouldn't have wanted him to, but Kingsley had looked so horrible. Moody returned only a few dodges and curses later. "Step aside now," he barked, looking grim. "Get lost. I'll take it from here." Harry didn't argue further. Moody had a wooden leg, but boy, he was fast. Harry felt he could finally turn his back on Dolohov and run. He wondered briefly what had befallen Barty Crouch, but if Moody was still standing and he was not, there was a door. There were, in fact, 2 doors from this room leading somewhere, but one of them was closer, and that decided Harry's choice. Running in, Harry saw combatants dispersed all over a round room which looked like a hurricane had raged through it. Tables overturned, cabinets in shambles, potions in puddles on the floor. Lucius Malfoy was fighting Emmeline Vance, while Lupin was engaged with some Death Eater Harry didn't recognize, and then Bill Weasley, Daedalus Diggle. "Potter, there you are!" Harry ducked instinctively, letting a curse sail over his head, and whirled around to see Dawlish charging at him. So much for the respite he'd been hoping for. The wound in his shoulder sent a jolt of sharp pain down his arm every time he moved, and now he'd get no time to fix it up. He fired a quick choking curse at Dawlish. Dawlish shielded, and Harry was free for a whole second, so tried to disappear into the crowd again. But it was important to remember that he had to get to the atrium. But Dawlish's cry had attracted attention. Another Death Eater appeared in front of Harry, wand pointed. "Crucio," he said. Harry ducked and hurled a chair at Dawlish. "Imperio!" Dawlish shouted, aiming at Harry, and there was only the killing curse missing from the unforgivables flying at him, and Harry was done. He spun out of the curse's way, shot a non-verbal reducto at the unknown Death Eater's feet, and jumped behind a huge cabinet that was standing nearby. From there, he threw a shattering curse at the row of crystal vials next to the Death Eater, to make him dance around like this was some fucked-up ballet, and then took aim at Dawlish. "Comprimo," Harry whispered, unsure he could use the mind curse non-verbally. The curse would create intense psychological pressure on Dawlish that would make him completely lose the will to fight, if it worked right. But, oddly, Harry encountered an obstacle as his curse assaulted the man. It was as if something wasn't letting his curse through, or something was giving resistance. Something. Harry rolled out of the way as the cabinet exploded under the force of a spell. "Crucio!" came another cry. Dawlish was clutching his head and not reacting to anything, so Harry focused on his other opponent. Sidestep, curse, dodge. He allowed one spell to hit his shield, responded with a spell to induce lung failure, and then wove a fast counter-curse to a specific, hugely unpleasant curse as he dove to the side. There was a choice: to let the laceration curse hit him, or else jump into the cruciatus. Laceration curse it was, and Harry gritted his teeth as his leg tore open with a small fountain of blood. Sidestep, curse, dodge. Harry's shield was held up by a barely noticeable effort of will. All that he needed was focus, aim, be alert, and he knew how to do this. He'd trained to do this, even if he hadn't trained for the stench of blood, or for moving through the pain, or for the sickening sound of bones breaking under the assault of his spells. Harry unconsciously registered another presence nearby, and was already whirling to cast in that direction when he saw that it was Lupin. "Need help?" Lupin asked. He looked battle-worn, but his eyes were bright. It took Harry a moment to process the question, but then he finally hit his opponent with a non-verbal spell to make skin paper-thin. From then on, it was child's play. One cutting curse, and the man was on the floor. Lupin looked torn between approval and disgust. "It's mostly the smell for me," he said. "I do hate the smell. It reminds me... Never mind." Harry shrugged. He didn't like it much either. He didn't cast these spells for fun. For the fun of it. It was just, if he wasn't fast enough and efficient enough, it would be him on the floor instead. "By the way, I'm not..." "Tonks," Harry had been planning to say, but couldn't. Because then a huge explosion shook the room. The entire wall opposite Harry caved in, revealing the adjacent chamber, and there was Voldemort. Voldemort had in a long black cloak, now speckled with dust all over. Harry froze in shock at the sight of the crimson eyes and the white face that had haunted his nightmares. He felt Lupin stiffen next to him, and heard the Death Eaters cheer. Next thing they saw, however, was Dumbledore appearing from the rubble. Dumbledore flicked his wand. The stone surface of the floor rose up in a smooth wave and darted towards Voldemort, clearly attempting to encircle him. A fraction of a second later, a wave of Voldemort's wand shattered the stone into tiny pieces with a thunderous noise. He flung them into the air and sent back at Dumbledore. Dumbledore shielded quickly, but that moment gave Voldemort the time to attack. He fired a killing curse. Dumbledore stepped out of its way, and shielded himself with a chair against another immediately. A subtle wave of his wand, and chains sprung from the floor around Voldemort. Voldemort sent another killing curse at Dumbledore, then noticed the chains. His spell tore them from the ground at once, and transformed them into spears, which he flung at Dumbledore. Dumbledore transfigured them, on the fly, into writhing ropes. They flew back at Voldemort, sailing through the air with a whoosh. Voldemort turned them into snakes and ordered them to attack, or so Harry guessed. He was glued to his spot, watching the rapid duel unfold. So were the others. Some people still faced off, but the focus of everyone's attention was on the fight. "Dumbledore's not trying to kill him," Harry thought, as he watched Dumbledore vanish the snakes and dodge another killing curse. Voldemort is aiming to kill, but Dumbledore's not. Why? Harry had no answer. It was only clear to him that Dumbledore wanted to hold Voldemort up, imprison him. Bars of a cage were growing around Voldemort now, or tie him down. But he was not trying to kill. Harry hoped to all that was holy that Dumbledore wasn't doing this because of the prophecy that said he had to kill Voldemort. Watching Dumbledore and Voldemort parry each other's blows with seeming effortlessness, Harry wasn't sure he'd ever reach the point when he'd be able to duel like that. He couldn't even take out Dolohov, and it was painfully clear that both Voldemort and Dumbledore would have wiped the floor with Dolohov in a matter of seconds. Voldemort deflected a net of stones to the side, through the hole to the next room. The resulting explosion deafened Harry for a second, and reverberated in his ears, and for a moment dust covered the room, and he couldn't see. The next thing he did see, and he hardly believed his eyes, was Auror Dawlish sneaking up behind Voldemort, looking every inch the man, knowing he was not going to survive his suicidal assault, and not caring anyway. Dawlish cast something. Harry didn't hear what, over the murmur of voices all around the room, but he did see very well what happened next. Voldemort whipped around and gave a condescending sneer. "What is this insolence?" Dumbledore made a motion with his arm, as if to swipe Dawlish away, remove him from harm, but Voldemort was faster. Among Dawlish's screams of injustice, imperious, and revenge, Voldemort twisted his wand just so, and Dawlish's head tore from his body and rolled on the floor, leaving a thick trail of blood. The body collapsed, silenced. Blood flowed freely from the neck, and people scattered out of the rolling head's way, and Harry, hardly able to tear his eyes away, suddenly knew with horrifying clarity that he was going to throw up. He tried casting all manner of horrible hexes tonight, many times. He'd cast a head-exploding curse at Dolohov, for fuck's sake. He hadn't expected this, though. He hadn't been prepared for the effect if he'd succeeded. Fuck. He stumbled away, backwards, not caring whom he pushed out of his path. Hands tried to stop him. The call of "Potter! Potter is here!" rang through the air, but Harry cast a string of curses and ran. The atrium. The atrium. He needed to get to the atrium. He dashed out of the room, and found himself in a small alcove instead. From there led 2 doors, and Harry tugged on the curtain of one, only to discover that it wasn't a door at all, but rather a mirror. A mirror that he knew and had seen before, the one that showed not his face, but his heart's desire. Harry ignored it, and rushed to tug on the second door, already hearing the heavy footfalls of someone chasing after him. On the other side, there was silence. Harry shut and warded the door on complete autopilot. The room first seemed brightly lit to him, but then he realized it was actually half dark, and then he figured the lighting was ambient, and then something changed again, and Harry understood the room was just messing with his head. It seemed both a storage and a research room, upon second glance. There were shelves lining the entire place, with artifacts on them under protective glass, and plaques explaining what they were. Mongolian Amulet of Power, Death Stick Prototype 3, Staff of Merlin, Model 14. What? Moving further in, Harry saw charts spread over tables and books lying open, something in runic script, and squibs, and muggle-borns, a comprehensive analysis, and who knew what else. The pounding on the door commenced about when Harry noticed a whole stack of what seemed to be altars with runes and skulls on them. He stumbled to another door, which opened into a narrow and dark little corridor, another extension of that storage space, except that things on the shelves here seemed broken. A door loomed at the end of the corridor. Harry attempted to run towards it, but his injuries refused to go ignored any longer. His recently wounded leg gave out under him, and the shoulder sent a spike of pain down his left arm. His world suddenly constricted to a series of bright flashes of pain. Harry didn't realize that his pursuer had already caught up with him until he felt the Expelliarmus hit him. Then it was already too late by half. Harry shook his head to clear it, and saw a huge, hulking Death Eater standing in his way, and smiling in a way that was both menacing and unfathomably idiotic at once. Crabbe Senior, Harry identified. Or Goyle. It didn't matter, really. What mattered was that Crabbe or Goyle was lumbering towards Harry, having pocketed both wands and clearly planning to take Harry out with bare hands. Harry lunged aside. He crashed into the shelves with his right, thankfully uninjured shoulder, but then Goyle, or Crabbe, was already aiming with his fist again.
"Don't move," he warned. "I am not here to kill you. Just sit still."
Harry ducked when he saw the huge fist coming at him, and the man hit the glass panel on one of the shelves. Shards and wooden planks rained on Harry, and he shielded his head with his arms, but it was all worth it as Crabbe or Goyle gave a roar of pain.
"You little bastard!"
he growled, and swung again. This was not going well. Wandless Harry couldn't pretend to do much, but then he saw what was lying on the floor next to him. Wands, several wands lay there. They must have fallen from the shelves. Some were broken, but some looked all right. Harry wasn't going to be picky. "Segrigo!" he cast rapidly, aiming with the first wand he grabbed. The effect he couldn't have predicted. Instead of the man's arm coming dislocated, huge gashes exploded over the front of his robes. The man gave a terrified scream and wobbled on his feet. For a moment his wide eyes locked with Harry's. Then he slowly fell forward, toppling right over Harry and the shelf. Harry slid completely to the floor under the weight of his assailant, feeling the man's warm blood seep through his robes. Nauseated and slightly panicked at the idea of staying pinned by that weight forever, Harry squirmed frantically away. Thankfully the man seemed to have passed out from the pain, so at least he wasn't groaning any more. It took Harry a while to free himself, and it had torn at his wounds and left him breathless, but at least he was reasonably safe now, and again in the possession of his wand, which he had fished out of Crabbe's or Goyle's pocket. The gash in his leg was bleeding profusely, and the arm was actually starting to go a little numb. In addition to that, Harry was feeling distinctly dizzy and just not okay. He tried to calm down and tell himself that it was okay to not feel okay, considering. It wasn't working. He looked at Goyle, or Crabbe, or whoever the fuck it was lying a hand's reach away, looking dead. Harry looked around, hoping to somehow find out what to do. Did he want this Crabbe or Goyle to be dead? He didn't know. He hadn't set out to kill anyone. He was beginning to feel claustrophobic, alone with the body in this narrow little corridor. No sounds infiltrated it, so he felt completely cut off from the world. Wincing, Harry got up and limped, as fast as he could, towards the door at the end of the corridor, trying not to think so much of Crabbe or Goyle and the blood still wet on his robes. Opening the door, he found that he was in luck for once. Black floor, black ceiling, blue torches, doors everywhere, the circular room again, and a Death Eater standing guard. Harry's wand was aimed at that person's back and firing a quiet stunner before they had even had the time to react. Harry stood on the threshold, looking over his options. Kingsley lay injured, and hopefully injured, not dead, in the room with the missing door. One of the other doors led to the room where the duel between Voldemort and Dumbledore was happening. A third one led to the elevators. The other 8 led God only knew where. The first door Harry tried didn't even open. The second connected to an odd amphitheatre-like chamber with an archway at the bottom. The third revealed another place with rows of shelves, although this one looked like significant fighting had happened here. Harry could hardly believe it when he finally saw the black floors and black ceiling of the corridor leading out of the Department of Mysteries. Finally! The atrium had never been nearer, or hope sweeter. Harry stumbled through the corridor. Soon he'd get to the hall where the elevator was. Just a few steps more. Which was when Harry saw Lucius Malfoy, stationed by the elevator. "Going somewhere, Potter?" Malfoy asked, wand held with deceptive carelessness in his fingers. He surveyed Harry's appearance haughtily, and Harry could only imagine what he looked like, covered in blood and dust, and looking like he'd been through a grinder. "I was, but then you're in my way," Harry said, desperation mounting. He was in no state to fight, Lucius Malfoy, right now. He really, really wasn't. "If only the world were to see the boy who lived now," Malfoy said. "You don't cut much of a figure, Potter, if you don't mind me saying." "Now, Lucius, that's quite enough," a very familiar voice said from behind Harry, and Harry froze in horror. It just couldn't be true. It couldn't. Harry turned around, wand raised, already knowing that it could. And it was. Voldemort was standing just a few feet away, between Harry and the door back to the Department of Mysteries. A mocking smile played on his lips as he observed Harry. "If you go on, Lucius, you will completely crush his fragile teenage ego," Voldemort continued, but his eyes were for Harry alone. "We'd want our opponent to have at least a little fighting spirit when we start on him, would we not?" Lucius had some way of alerting Voldemort, Harry recalled dully. That had been the whole point of his visit to Hogwarts. Funny how such details tended to fall by the wayside when one saw heads being ripped off people, and blood gushing in streams, and death, and... Harry wondered whether the same end awaited him. "Hard to believe, is it not, that this pathetic boy is destined to be my deathly foe?" Voldemort said. "I'm almost insulted." Why almost? Harry wondered, and realized that he'd spoken aloud when Voldemort replied. "Ah, because you do hold a small measure of interest, Harry Potter," his crimson eyes flashed. "All these coincidences, your curious survival twice already. No matter, no matter. It all ends tonight." "Are you sure you even dared try another killing curse on me?" Harry's mouth said, quite independently on him. "Didn't work for you the first 2 times, seeing as I'm still alive anyway." "Not for much longer," Voldemort announced menacingly, taking a step forward. "Avada Kedavra!" Harry stumbled to the side. There was absolutely no cover, and nowhere to run either. With nothing to lose, Harry cast the killing curse in return. Voldemort stepped out of its way, and sent another killing curse at Harry. Harry ducked, so the curse ricocheted off the gleaming black wall, and reflected towards the elevator where Lucius Malfoy was standing. Malfoy quickly dodged it. Harry could hardly hear anything over the pounding of blood in his ears, but he saw people emerging from the staircase near the elevator. He thought he recognized the man leading the crowd, but then that man stepped right into the way of the stray killing curse. He was gaping and wide-eyed as he collapsed, motionless, onto the floor. Voldemort was already casting another killing curse, and so was Harry. Harry supposed there might have been screams, but he didn't notice, because the 2 killing curses collided in mid-air right then. They latched onto each other, connecting Harry and Voldemort's wands in a stream of deep gold colour instead of killing curse green. Harry found he couldn't let go of the wand. It was shaking horribly, so he gripped it with both hands, eyes wide, unsure what to do. Beams of light splintered off the golden connection, forming a golden dome over Harry and Voldemort. What on earth? Voldemort, to Harry's relief, didn't look like he knew what was happening either. In fact, he looked unsettled, scared even. This steadied Harry's resolve. He focused on the golden stream. All had seemed lost just a few moments ago, but now, what did he have to do? How could he use this? What was this? Harry felt Voldemort trying to break the connection, and concentrated on not letting him, because what Voldemort wanted was surely bad for Harry, and if Voldemort was suffering, so much the better. Harry's breath came in short gasps. Sweat drops ran down his neck and into his robes. He closed his eyes momentarily. He couldn't keep holding this forever either. There had to be something. He had to get control of Voldemort's wand. Voldemort's wand. An idea ever so clear entered Harry's head, and it seemed so simple and logical that he didn't know what he'd been confused about. "Expelliarmus," he whispered, gazing intently into the connection. His wand gave a huge lurch in his hands, and a shock went through it, and then through Harry, and then the connection hummed and shivered and grew an angry red, and Harry's vision was suddenly going red too, and he was no longer sure it had been such a clever idea. Suddenly he wasn't standing in his place any more. Instead, he saw an ashen-faced Harry Potter opposite him, holding a wildly shaking wand with both hands, and he was angry. He was the greatest wizard of his time. He had immense power at his command, and yet this brat was creating this somehow, attacking him inside his mind. Harry slammed into himself. His eyes were watering, and he could hardly think or stand or be anyone. There was a flash of white-hot pain, a deluge of scalding fire, and then a force knocked into Harry, sending him away, flying, flying, flying. Harry saw Dumbledore's beard hanging over him at an odd angle, and then there was pain assaulting every inch of his body before he knew why, and then there was the Order and the Ministry workers and Mediwizards, and noise, lots of noise, and cameras flashing, and why couldn't they all just shut up? "You mean to say this was Harry?" someone was asking from beyond the Mediwizards. "The entire night? Who else but Harry Potter could have repelled you know who?" "Yes, but the duels and the spells and the... It was supposed to be Tonks. With all respect to her, that bit at the end, as Daedalus says. But how did he survive? He's a 15-year-old kid, for Merlin's sake. But I saw him cast... How did he... Non-verbal spells. How does he... Harry winced as the bones in his leg moved, directed by a Mediwizard's wand, and then connected together with a crack. His head throbbed something awful, and his entire left arm felt like it would fall off, and he wouldn't miss it for all the pain it was causing. And his leg... shit! Images of tonight's fight flashed before his mind's eye, replacing each other with nauseating speed, almost supplanting reality. Voldemort, Dawlish severed head, blood all over Crabbe, and Kingsley dying on the floor. Voldemort, and a strange connection, and fire. A fire? He was so tired. "I want to see my godson!" a voice shouted suddenly over the ruckus. "Take me where you like, but I want to see my godson first." Squinting through the haze that surrounded him, Harry focused on the source of the noise, and sure enough, Sirius Black's ragged and bloodied face emerged from the crowd. The man was held at the arms by some ministry personnel, who looked no less wild than he did. "Harry!" Black exclaimed, barging through and dragging the officials with him. "You're fine, thank everything." "Mr. Black, you're being held on the charges of... I don't care, let me... "I'm fine, Sirius," Harry said, his voice emerging as a pitiful rasp. "Really, are you... what is... "Excuse me, gentlemen," Dumbledore said, appearing somehow right between Harry and Black. "I believe we must resolve this misunderstanding." Harry closed his eyes. His eyelids were getting much too heavy. He wondered dimly whether Black was going straight back to Azkaban. He found himself hoping it wasn't the case. "Drink this, Mr. Potter," a Mediwizard told Harry, pressing a glass vial to his lips. It felt like only a wink had passed between the horrid taste of the potion hitting Harry's senses and Harry waking up in a hospital bed at the Hogwarts infirmary. However, Madame Pomfrey was already running her scans on him, and saying that he'd slept for over 48 hours. Harry blinked, disoriented. Last he'd seen and heard, and felt was pain, noise, blood. Now, still and sterile surroundings. "Your nervous system dearly needed the rest," Madame Pomfrey told him. "The damage you sustained is impossible to describe, for it is beyond the scope of current medical research." "I'm fine now, though, aren't I?" Harry asked, turning his head this way and that, and rolling his shoulder. No trace of the remembered pain, but he did still feel sluggish and tired. "You are healed for the moment, Mr. Potter, but there's no saying what long-term consequences might come of this. Do abstain from doing anything dangerous in the upcoming weeks," Madame Pomfrey ordered. "I understand," Harry said. "I hope so," Madame Pomfrey said severely, "because you have already survived the impact of the killing curse twice, and whatever happened at the Ministry put your nervous system through further strain still. We cannot know how much you can take, because by all rights you should already be dead," Harry finished inwardly, and looked away from Madame Pomfrey's guilty face. She clearly hadn't intended to put it like that, but it was the truth, and that was fine. Your friends came to see you, the matron said after a pause. And the headmaster requested to talk to you once you are awake. While I would not yet advise you to leave the hospital wing, I can alert him if you wish. Thank you, Harry said. That would be nice. Nice wasn't the word for it exactly, but Dumbledore could potentially shed light on what had happened at the Ministry and afterwards. Harry had questions. Many of them. Harry, Dumbledore began cheerfully, once Madame Pomfrey left them alone. Then his face fell. Harry, I'm glad to see you so well recovered, but I also know that I have failed you, and I only hope that you will find it in your heart to forgive me. Harry looked away from Dumbledore and out the window at the sunny afternoon. It had not yet occurred to him in the rush of events to be angry at Dumbledore for anything, but now he realized that he might perhaps have cause to. Dumbledore had promised to protect him at the Ministry, but the night had ended with Harry standing alone against Voldemort. However, Harry was feeling more resigned than angry about that. Besides which, Voldemort was exposed, wasn't he? Harry said, and was surprised by how detached he sounded. I remember there were Ministry people there. The mission was successful. Yes, Dumbledore answered carefully. The Ministry has now acknowledged Voldemort's return. And this success wouldn't have been possible without my participation, Harry continued, because if I had not come along, the mission would not have gone ahead. Yes, your participation was invaluable, Dumbledore agreed. And if I had left earlier in the evening by Portkey, I would not have delayed Voldemort, and no connection would have trapped him at the Ministry to be seen by people, Harry said. Yes, indeed, Dumbledore replied, but he was frowning now. Harry could then ask the final question that would reveal what he'd been driving at. He could ask childishly what Dumbledore's apology meant in that case. Knowing the result, did Dumbledore truly regret the way it had come about? However, Harry already knew the answer. They'd had this conversation before. I regret asking so much from you. But you ask anyway. This apology wasn't about Dumbledore's failure to protect him, Harry was sure. It was about not regretting the turn of events, whatever they had cost Harry, because they'd been beneficial for the cause in the end. It was perhaps a mark of the tiredness that Harry still felt, not just physical, but some exhaustion that seemed soul-deep that he could not summon up any indignation. "What happened at the Ministry?" he asked, abruptly, changing the subject. "And what has been happening since then?" Dumbledore observed Harry in silence a little before answering, as if he was contemplating a return to the previous topic. In the end, he wisely decided to let the sleeping dogs lie. "I believe you will find Wizarding Britain a much changed place upon your awakening," he said. "The political changes that have occurred are significant. You might remember, of course, that Cornelius Fudge fell victim to one of the stray curses that night." Harry started. He hadn't remembered, but now he could see it clearly in his mind's eye. The official that had walked into the path of Voldemort's killing curse, his panicked face, his wide-open eyes. Harry had been in shock and hadn't recognized him then, but it was obvious in retrospect. "So, he's dead," Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore confirmed, looking at Harry closely again, perhaps discomfited by the lack of emotion in Harry's voice. "As such, he is quite naturally no longer Minister. An emergency election is being held next week." "What's the Ministry been doing?" "They have been alerting the world to Voldemort's return," Dumbledore said, "and arranging for national security, as well as reshuffling the ranks along with their ideas." Harry was about to ask what that meant, exactly, but then figured he'd be better off finding out from his friends. They'd tell him all kinds of colourful Ministry gossip, he was sure. "What's Voldemort been doing?" he asked. "Or actually, what happened at the Ministry? Did they arrest any Death Eaters? Did the Order get into trouble? Or Sirius Black? How about Kingsley?" "Kingsley did not survive his first night at the hospital," Dumbledore pronounced solemnly. "His wounds were far too grave. His loss is a blow to us all." Harry thought back to the fight with Dolohov. He remembered Dolohov's smug smile and wanted to wipe it off his face. He recalled Kingsley's worried air and wondered whether there was anything he could have done better, whether he should have just shut up and followed Kingsley's instruction from the start, whether he could have protected Kingsley somehow. Even though the very thought was ridiculous, Dolohov was much too strong for Harry to deal with. That had been abundantly clear. He wished he hadn't been Kingsley's last assignment.
Hestia Jones is at St. Mungo's, Dumbledore continued. She's getting expert help, although she will suffer some effects for the rest of her life. Sirius is still in ministry custody in a holding cell, but I have managed to convince them not to send him to Azkaban. Many others have sustained wounds, but thankfully they did not all need hospitalization.
What about the unspeakable Croaker? Harry asked. He was unable to recall what had happened to the man. Dumbledore smiled.
Mr. Croaker secluded himself away from the fight very early on, and activated the available alarms, he said. A very rational man, Mr. Croaker.
Harry could just imagine.
Auror Dawlish, on the other hand, has suffered a gruesome fate, Dumbledore said, and Harry couldn't help his grimace at the memory. The poor man was placed under Imperius, and made a puppet in the Death Eater's hands, but his last stand was admirable. Alas, Dumbledore sighed. Azkaban, meanwhile, has acquired new additions. Several Death Eaters were arrested, among them one Lucius Malfoy.
Harry nodded.
Who else? Jugson and McNair and several others. Unfortunately, some rather prominent Death Eaters slipped through, Bellatrix Lestrange and Antonin Dolohov among them. Alastair Moody claims that the young Barty Crouch was quite permanently indisposed by the end of their duel, but his body was not found.
How about Crabbe or Goyle?
Of Mr. Crabbe I know nothing, but I believe that Donatus Goyle was found dead in a small corridor close to one of the big rooms, Dumbledore said, and gave Harry a piercing look.
Oh, Harry said, feeling cold.
Donatus. He hadn't known the man's name was Donatus. He hadn't been entirely sure he'd killed the man either. This was war. Of course he'd have to kill someone, eventually. The exhaustion he felt only intensified with that thought. Did it maybe get easier? He wasn't sure he wanted it to get easier. It was already so easy to kill someone. You might not even know you'd done it, and there it was, like magic. And Voldemort would kill Harry if Harry didn't kill him.
What was it when I once connected? Harry asked, shaking his head to dispel the images. Mine and Voldemort's, I mean, at the Ministry. There was this golden beam.
Ah, yes, Dumbledore said. A most curious occurrence. Harry waited. You see, Harry, I am not sure that you are aware of this, but you wand and Voldemort are brothers, Dumbledore said. The cause of both your wands are phoenix feathers from the same phoenix. Fawkes, as it happens.
And this sort of thing happens every time brother wands try to fight each other?
Dumbledore sighed. What you must take into account, Harry, is that your situation is completely unique. Yes, brother wands generally produce unexpected effects when fighting each other. However, the wand also chooses its master, and the masters of these brother wands happen to be so intricately linked.
Harry reflected that he was getting kind of sick of every strange occurrence around him, of which there were many, being explained away as a side effect of his and Voldemort's connection. It was as if everything about him was defined by their link.
I understand, said Harry. But what was it? There was this moment when I was like in his head or something, and then there was this explosion, and I just don't understand that. Dumbledore glanced slowly around the empty ward, then back at Harry. I believe that you may have somehow been a catalyst for that, he said. I am not entirely certain how, but you seemed to have sent an unexpected burst of power in Voldemort's direction, which took him by surprise and shattered his defences for a few moments. An unprecedented feat, I assure you. Due to the highly charged magics coursing through and around you, you somehow managed to perform unintended legilimency on Voldemort, which he quickly recognized and purged you from his mind. The explosion, I suppose, was the result of these bursts of power in an already extremely charged environment.
Harry thought on this. It all made sense, except for one thing. I performed unintended... What? Dumbledore sighed.
Legilimency, he said, which is a much longer conversation, and I'm not sure we should have it at this stage in the proceedings.
I would really rather know, Harry insisted. It was as if I ended up inside his head.
You did, Dumbledore allowed. Unintentionally, of course. Intentionally, it takes great skill and practice, especially since Voldemort himself is a great legilimens.
A person who can look into people's minds? Harry asked, with stirrings of horror.
Yes, Dumbledore said.
He still looked uncertain that he should be discussing this. Harry was growing more certain by the second. There are people who can read minds in the wizarding world.
Not read, per se, Dumbledore corrected. Your initial assessment was correct. Look into people's minds to see their memories and sense their feelings.
And Voldemort is one of those people, Harry said.
Indeed.
With all due respect, Headmaster, you are telling me this now? Harry abruptly felt like leaving the wizarding world or drowning himself in the lake. He'd lived here for so long, and he hadn't known... What else didn't he know? Who of his classmates could read minds also? Who of the people around him? What other fundamentally life-changing magics was he not aware of?
While a highly skilled legilimens, Voldemort has not yet acquired the ability to penetrate minds over distance, Dumbledore said calmly. Since you do not spend extended periods of time in his presence, I felt that this ability posed no particular danger to you.
And when I do meet him, I can just assume that he can read my every thought, Harry said, thinking back to the things he had thought in Voldemort's presence before. It was intensely humiliating because most of those times he'd been scared shitless. Is there a way to defend against this? Harry demanded. There must be. You said he threw me out of his mind. How?
There is a technique known as occlumency, Dumbledore said. Using it, you can shield your mind against intrusion. However, it is extremely difficult and not widely known, and hardly any people find it worthwhile, considering how few legilimency practitioners there are.
Who can do it of people that I know? Harry asked, and then felt like hitting himself. Of course. You can, Headmaster, can't you? Which ranked right second after Voldemort being a mind-reader, because while not his sworn enemy, Dumbledore was still not a person Harry wanted to share his every thought with. To think that Dumbledore might have been reading his mind all this time.
Indeed I can, but I assure you that I never abuse this skill, Dumbledore said.
Who else can do this legilimency thing?
Legilimency, Dumbledore corrected. Not many Order members at all. Alastair knows the basics, but he is much better at occlumency, Dumbledore added. The younger Barty Crouch is, or was, evidently a practitioner as well, which is why I did not see through his disguise in your 4th year, as I am sure you understand, although I would not be surprised if you were capable of legilimency also.
Who else? Harry insisted, frowning.
Remus possesses some natural occlumency skills that come from his lycanthropic affliction, but he is no legilimens. Sirius had been exposed to both arts in his childhood, I believe. They are obscure and today practised for the most part in very old pureblood families, such as the Blacks. Sirius does not have the personality for mastering occlumency or legilimency, however.
While Dumbledore talked, Harry had been thinking. It soon dawned on him what he should have seen at once. Professor Snape, he said, with a growing feeling of doom. He must know this, mustn't he? If he's a spy? The world was officially ending. Harry's horrible head of house had been reading his mind since 1st year.
Professor Snape does indeed practice both of these arts, as they are essential in his line of work, Dumbledore confirmed. Like me, however, he exercises utmost discretion when it comes to students, or indeed any social interactions.
Right, Harry said. Headmaster, I'm quite sure that I need to learn this or clemency. That as soon as possible. Please believe me when I say that neither myself nor Professor Snape are in the habit of infringing upon your privacy, Harry, Dumbledore said. He looked upset by this idea, but surely he couldn't expect Harry to live in a world where people could read minds without having defended his own. It's not that, Harry said, or not entirely that. It's just that if I know that some enemy might read my mind, then I'd want to prevent that from happening. What if Voldemort finds out something from me? Or you said that Barty Crouch could do this too. It doesn't matter how rare mind reading is, it's still dangerous. In the Order there are only two people who could teach you, Harry, Professor Snape and myself, Dumbledore said. If you do seriously wish to learn, I can try to arrange some tutoring for next year. Right now it is not entirely possible, what with the Ministry upheaval and the defence position being open again. The defence position? Harry repeated, deciding not to focus for now on the nightmare that would be opening his mind up to Snape or Dumbledore voluntarily. Isn't Professor Umbridge... Dumbledore looked suddenly grim. Professor Umbridge has not yet recovered from the intense psychological ordeal she'd undergone on the day of your ministry visit. While she has ostensibly suffered a nervous breakdown, there are witnesses who claim they saw the Weasley twins manhandling her in the corridors that same day. That's not possible, Harry said. It wasn't. He'd specifically agreed with the Weasley twins that they'd stay the fuck away from Umbridge that entire day. They were certainly not to manhandle her anywhere. And yet the witnesses claim it is true, Dumbledore said. An official investigation into this matter might be launched any day now, depending on the Ministry's situation. It is extremely unstable at the moment. Harry needed to talk to the twins as soon as possible then. So, what is happening to the defence position? He asked, just to fill the silence. I plan to invite Emily Vance to serve as your defence instructor for the remainder of the year, Dumbledore said. She has not yet agreed. She has declined on a previous occasion when I suggested it, for she did not want to be seen openly associating with me. In those troubled times, it was important for her role in the Order to maintain a seemingly aloof stand and remain in good graces of the pureblood faction. Now, however, our fortunes are changing, and I am a persona non grata in the Ministry no more. I believe she might agree. This was all too much information for Harry's already overloaded brain. However, he wasn't calling an end to this conference without asking a final, desperate question. He wasn't even sure he expected an honest answer, but he had to try. Headmaster, Harry said, today I found out about people in the wizarding world who can read minds. I would have really appreciated knowing about this before. Is there anything else, anything relevant to the war, to my position in it, to me potentially fighting Voldemort, that I still need to know, or might need to know? A rather lengthy silence followed this question, but Harry was determined to wait it out. Then Dumbledore gave a sigh. Yes, Harry, he said. Yes, in all truth, there is still something very important that you should be made aware of. I did not confide in you before, mainly because I was not sure how you would handle this knowledge and the task ahead. However, in the light of your recent adventure at the Ministry, it would be most unseemly of me to deny you this information, for you have proven yourself again and again. Harry's heart sank. Dumbledore sounded really, really serious, and whatever this unknown thing was, it wasn't going to be good news. However, Dumbledore continued emphatically, it would be equally selfish of me to impart this knowledge when you have just woken up from a traumatic experience and have had to face a lot of other information besides. I will let you rest for now. I swear to you that I will tell you everything when you feel that you are ready. You may come to my office at any later point you wish, and I will either tell you then, if I am not otherwise engaged, or arrange a suitable time with you. Harry's initial desire was to protest. If there was important stuff to be known, he wanted to hear it now. On the other hand, it was true that his head was already hurting from all the talking and thinking, and he was growing exponentially more tired. So many things to process.
perhaps he'd leave any remaining apocalyptic revelations till later. "Thank you for telling me all this," he said. Dumbledore gave another sigh. "I fear that you are right, Harry, in that you really do need to know. You are, of course, much too young, but I cannot be pushing you towards battle with one hand and concealing knowledge in the other behind my back. The night at the Ministry showed me with great clarity that we, the adults, have failed you." Harry frowned uncomprehendingly. Dumbledore gave him a sad smile. "Do not mistake me, Harry. I am proud of your achievements. I was very impressed that you could defend yourself so well, and your dueling skills are beyond what we, in the Order, or even as your teachers, could have imagined." Despite feeling that Dumbledore was not going to continue in this congratulatory manner, Harry allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. "However, I wish that you had not needed to go to these lengths," Dumbledore said, his voice solemn. "I wish, although it is too late, that you had not known half those spells, and not seen half of what you'd seen. I wish that your soul had remained as bright and pure as it had been when you defeated an ancient basilisk with a sword and a phoenix song. But I cannot fault you for straying from the clear path, because we did not see it happen, and we should have. By Merlin, we should have." Harry wasn't sure he liked that view of him, that he was some lost soul in need of salvation. He knew this related to the same feeling that Dumbledore had expressed when Fawkes had refused to carry Harry out of the Ministry, and he'd much rather be asked, "What have you done?" than, "What has been done to you?" "Headmaster, I'm not—" "Please, Harry," Dumbledore said, holding up a hand. "I'm afraid that I will call in a privilege of old age, and say that you must live to my years to understand fully what I say, even though I know it is annoying for you to hear. Let me just say that I have seen, heard, or could guess at some of the things that you have done at the Ministry." Dumbledore made a meaningful pause. "And I am glad to have seen in you today that, whatever you've had to do, it has not come to you easily. I rejoice in the thought that you might perhaps draw some valuable lessons from this and grow into the person that I know you are meant to be." Harry didn't know what kind of person he was meant to be. He just wanted to go to sleep and forget that he was the kind of person who was meant to defeat Voldemort. Harry gazed at the ripples on the lake as he walked along the shore. The day was chilly and windy, so Hogwarts grounds were mostly free of roaming students, which was good. Harry didn't want to see people. He wanted to think. It had only been 3 days since the battle at the Ministry, 2 of which Harry had spent unconscious. To him it felt that these 3 days had lasted a whole lifetime, during which he had fought in a long and difficult war, the outcome of which was unclear because the losses were still being counted. The Wizarding Press trumpeted Harry as the victor in the most significant duel of the decade. "The boy who lived saves us all again," the headlines proclaimed. Or, "Boy who lived not at St. Mungo's, sources say." Or, then, "Witness accounts of the Ministry duel. Magic the likes of which I have never seen." The word of Harry's duel with Voldemort had spread, as had the wild rumours of its outcome. By all reports, Harry had performed some hitherto unseen incredible magic, and the last feat of this magnitude had been achieved by Harry himself when he thwarted Voldemort as a baby. This combination of facts somehow inevitably led people to believe that Harry was the answer to all questions being asked, now that the Ministry had openly acknowledged Voldemort's return. There would be a war, no doubt about that. Open hostilities hadn't yet begun, but people were already terrified, already looking for a saviour. Harry recognized that his fortunes had changed drastically for the better. He knew that he could use the public's desire to see him as their hero, and planned to milk the adoration for all it was worth, especially since it was most likely temporary. In a coldly logical, calculating manner, he was pleased at the turn of events. Jubilant he was not. and it had not occurred to him that he could be about any of this until he'd met with his friends on the day of his release from the hospital. They seemed excited.
"Don't do things by half measures, do you? It was only the greatest battle of the last decade that you got involved in."
They'd been relieved.
"I ask you to be careful, and you go fight you know who. Don't you ever again. We didn't know how you were for days."
They approved.
"Good job, Harry. We knew you had it in you."
Neville had beamed at Harry, Cedric had ruffled his hair, Anthony had shaken his hand, and Milly had punched his arm. They had all seemed inordinately pleased to see him and cheerful about life. This had thrown Harry for a loop, because it hadn't occurred to him to be happy about the battle. He'd thought about it during the long night he had been forced to spend in the hospital wing. He'd thought about his reasons for going and about the results achieved. He'd wondered whether his reasons would have still stood, even if he'd known what the battle would be like. He compared what he'd expected from the battle to the reality of it. He hadn't known what he'd be facing, despite the duels he'd participated in before. He'd never before truly seen the curses he'd casually studied put to proper use. It was one thing to read and memorize the wand movements and the incantation for the entrails expelling curse. It was another thing entirely to see it done and understand the kind of magic you had been casting. He'd never before seen Aurors and Death Eaters or Voldemort and Dumbledore engaged in a serious fight. It gave Harry a measure of his own power, as well as put them into perspective. He could hold his own in a fight with adults, but knowing that he had to defeat Voldemort, he wasn't sure he'd ever measure up. He'd also never killed anyone before. Looking at the happy and smiling faces of his friends, Harry had realized with a jolt of something that was a little like wistfulness and a lot like despair, that none of them still ever had done any of that, and that Harry hadn't felt like explaining any of it at all. He'd have to, though, Harry acknowledged, as he looked at the lake. There were only that many things he could withhold from his friends before he became disconnected from them completely. They might not be able to understand everything, and Harry thought ruefully he wasn't going to tell them everything, but they had to be told some things. The prophecy, for instance. Harry closed his eyes against the sun, motionless for the moment. It was safe to tell them the prophecy now that Voldemort knew its contents, and they did need to know. Neville knew already, of course, but Neville was different. Neville could have been in Harry's shoes now, and Harry in Neville's, if fate, or chance, had not willed otherwise. Fate. Harry shivered as a gust of wind blew over him. He wondered what Voldemort was doing.